Thank you very much, everybody, for coming together. So what I thought we'd do is get a community of us together here today and have a bit of a discussion. There'll be no selling, absolutely no selling from anyone, but a discussion so everyone can just disseminate information between ourselves. And at the moment, it's very different. I'm just going to mute everyone while I talk, if I figure out how to do this. So we're going to have an open discussion around all of the issues that are presented with we are presented with at the moment. Some of those are more short-term or right up in our grill, so to speak, and some of the others which we're going to speak to are things that we can see from dealing with our clients and my professional networks, accountants, brokers, providers of AML, checks, all the sort of people that I'm running into daily in terms of what's going on out there. Obviously, at the best of times, as a lot of business owners on here will attest, and advisors, that we're making decisions with limited information, but at the moment that limited information has been taken to drastic levels, and there's a lot of information lacking in terms of what to do next. So I just wanted to get as many good people that I am associated with together and get everyone talking. So without further ado, I think I'm going to get Kayne Wahlstrom, because we're going to try and go from the more general or sort of information around the economy and what's going on down to the more specific type of topics around, say, legal, in terms of question and answer, a bit more of an engaged process there, because people will have probably more questions around that. So I'm going to get Kayne. I'm just going to unmute you, Kayne, and get you to kick it off, please, sir.
Cool, thanks, Shane. Cool. Hi all. Kayne Wahlstrom here. I own a property advisory firm and a brokerage up in Ponsonby in Auckland. So I've actually put together a list of factors, negative and positive, that I think, and from economists as well, will probably shape the housing market moving forward. Like I said, a lot of this is our personal opinion, also to a lot of feedback, and we're getting a ton of questions over the past month from clients as to what's happening, what to do. And so I've just pulled a whole lot of information together, and I'll run through it. So firstly, I'm going to start with the negatives on the factors that may influence the housing market. So first and foremost, job losses and job security. So that's going to impact hugely. Obviously, will decrease deposits that people may have. Will create negative impact on debt servicing to obtain a mortgage for people. And with the predictions of unemployment potentially hitting between 10 and 25%, could be quite dramatic in that space. So that's probably a big negative impact. Following on from that, we've got potential of SMEs, which New Zealand's built on, folding and not coming back. I saw an article from Sir Bob Jones mentioning about 400 restaurants in Wellington that won't reopen, which is obviously astronomical. 200,000 temporary working visa foreigners will not be needed and won't return to the shores, which is obviously in the hospital and tourism space, which is massive, which obviously adds to unemployment. A big one that we've been asked, or clients have been asking us, is around downsizing. So obviously at the moment, people might be holding bigger mortgages or big mortgages, and they're potentially going to look to reduce or downsize that home to reduce that debt. So there could be downsizing in property. Temporary net migration stalling, obviously with our borders closed for the foreseeable future. We won't have anyone coming in. A big one, loss of retirement of wealth. So people getting close to retirement that have invested, we've seen their portfolios take a hit. And so we may see downsizing in property, but also too reverse mortgages coming back in that space as well. Student apartments. Prices are definitely going to fall in these areas, in the inner cities where we've got these student apartments and for foreigners and that's going to take a hit, as well as Airbnbs probably, where we're going to see a lot of these dwellings return to the long-term rental market, and also too some of those properties going back where the people are just going to live in them themselves. We're already seeing it. Non-bank lenders will start to downsize and also retrench back to probably Australia. This has been huge in the last 5 years in the space, which probably needed to be filled, where, you know, might have had some adverse credit, or a sole trader, or someone going out on their own for the first 12 months and being able to obtain a mortgage through a second-tier lender for a short period of time. So this market is going to downsize and probably retrench a bit. What we're seeing at the moment in terms of bank lending, so banks have closed their doors at the moment for new to bank clients. They're just focusing on their current clients to help them get through this period for mortgage holidays, business loans, all this kind of stuff. So they're really focusing on that. KiwiSaver funds, obviously, from market volatility, a lot of people that may have been relying on this for deposit may have lost a bit of money in this, so their deposits become smaller. Obviously, with the government coming out around the tenants and rent freezes and evictions, this may be a bit of an impact short term. We may see rents fall over areas, and that may be more so in the regions than the cities. Regional investing will decrease. We're seeing and we're hearing a lot of investors pulling back and not wanting to invest into regional areas at present, because sectors or employment are normally built on one sort of industry in those areas. So there's a bit of unnecessary or unease around that. And we feel commercial properties will take a hit. The feedback we're getting lately, obviously, is with maybe hospital and retail taking a big hit here, and we've seen some of our big clients reducing or rent payments or whatever it may be. So the commercial property investment might not be as worthwhile initially moving forward. So that's sort of, I've just summarised the negatives there. And if we move through into the positives, and there are some here, banks are really well placed at the moment. They learnt really well from the GFC, and the RBNZ implemented sort of those macroprudent rules, the loan to value ratios, the stress testing, the credit profiling. So they are well capitalised to help moving forward. We're obviously in a really low interest rate environment, and the feeling is we'll stay in that for some time. So money's so cheap to borrow. What came out the other day was the Reserve Bank has asked all the banks to come back on their feedback around lifting the loan to value ratios, and we've been dealing with the banks the last couple of days, and they're all actually gearing up to potentially lift this. Well, obviously case by case and criteria included, but that will stimulate the economy quite quickly, we think. High net migration of actually Kiwis coming home. So obviously Kiwis living offshore, Australia and abroad. A lot of these will lose their jobs and actually come home rather than staying offshore. So that could bring a bit of a net migration of Kiwis coming back. Working from home, we've had this in the last sort of couple of weeks. Everyone's sort of learning that you can work from home through technology now. And so we're kind of getting inquiries around adding an extra second dwelling on the property for a home office, or renovating and creating a home office. So external overheads will be reduced, but then they may add a bit of personal debt or mortgage debt to it to help with this. Less overseas travel, obviously, especially for the next 12 months. So more discretionary spending back into the economy that way, and obviously local housing as well. People saving money, again, pushing money into the economy. We know, we've learnt in the past, and we've learnt through all the other post-historic events, that this is only temporary, so we will recover over time. So obviously, if you're holding on to an asset, that will go up in value over time. The support measures which have been put in by the government, so obviously the wage subsidy, the business loan back scheme, the tax back losses, the mortgage holidays and the interest-only loans. Like, from a banking point of view, the mortgage holidays and interest-only loans have been flying out the door, and at minimal output from the client or the retailer that needs it. It's literally just an email or a one-page document, and then they're put onto a mortgage holiday or a 12-month interest-only loan. I don't really agree with the mortgage holiday too much, because people don't really know the ins and outs of what it actually does, and it actually is a detriment to them in the next sort of 3 years. But if it's worst case scenario, then they have to do it. I personally think jobs will be offered to Kiwis, obviously more with foreigners leaving the shores and not coming in. A lot of jobs that would normally have gone to a foreigner probably will go to a Kiwi to help fill that sector. And we've always had a preference as Kiwis to invest in property, and obviously with the share market volatility of what's going on, that may come back even more, so that will continue. We still have a housing shortage. There's probably going to be a bit of feeding frenzy post-lockdown with we've had so many people reach out to us to say, hey, I've had time in my hands, my job is stable, my income is stable, we want to go this way, achieve these goals, so they're actually getting ready to buy post-lockdown. Commercial investors probably will switch to residential at some point to go, hey, it's a safer investment until we kind of know what that market looks like and does. And over the last sort of 10 years, people have had great equity in property post GFC, so they are well placed to capitalise on that moving forward. So I suppose just in summary, again, my personal view is that the New Zealanders and government, we need money to flow back through the economy. Firstly, just by spending in hospo and retail, and then obviously moving into tourism, which will be domestic to start with, to help unemployment. I think at present, industry, the hospo and retail and tourism make about 15% of our employment sector. And if we're forecasting an unemployment rate between 10 and 26%, it's going to be pretty astronomical there. I think it'll be on the lower side though. We realise that credit plays a big part to our economy for cash flow, and banks are really well equipped to do this. And with the RBNZ potentially talking about the loan to value ratios being released, which will be, I'm not too sure how I feel on that a little bit, depending, because the problem is we're not going to know the true effect of what's happened in COVID for another 12 months. If we're looking at property, we're coming into winter, which is historically low sales volume. We're in an election year, which people do put big purchases on hold. And we're 12 months away from actually understanding what our unemployment rate is, because companies for the next 12 months will go through restructures. You'll have the initial restructures where people can't afford to keep people on right now. And then 3, 6, 9, 12 months time will be the full effect. So all in all, the property market is 12 months away probably from knowing what's going to happen. But like in any type of investment purchase, you just got to be ready, stay ready, understand all your implications, and then obviously invest for time. That's all.
Thanks very much, Kayne. That was fantastic. So I'm going to get Chris Small to speak next, and then we'll sort of band you two guys together. And then you guys can ask questions by putting the hand up function or just raising your hand. And then we'll get those questions directed at both of you, because there's going to be some crossover and similarity. So Chris Small from ABC, Managing Director, do you want to take us away, please, mate?
Yeah, so sorry I was late for that. I had a few technical issues. Are we covering cash flow here, Shane, and banking?
If you could please give a very similar talk that you gave when we did the ABC one last week, that'd be awesome.
Yep, no problem. So I guess what we've been sort of trying to educate all our business clients on is that cash flow is king. Cash flow is the lifeblood to any business. And so the first directive I guess we've been given is all businesses need to put together a cash flow forecast. This is essential not only for your own understanding of where your business is, but for any stakeholders, including bankers and fellow shareholders where you may be looking for extra funding. And in short, a cash flow starts off with where your current bank balances are today or where they were pre-COVID, and then ascertaining what monies you've got coming in, so monies from customers, and then what monies are going out, so monies to creditors, wages, leases, and then that'll give you a really clear picture of where your funding gap is. So clearly in these times, if you're a hospitality business, you're going to have less income coming in, but you may still have your wages and your lease costs. So you need to see what that gap is, and then do the appropriate planning. And at the moment, that planning really revolves around a few key things. One is talking to your bank, and I'm an ex-banker. I was 20 years in banking in reasonably senior positions. And I've been talking to all the banks over this period on behalf of clients or on behalf of our own businesses, and they've been very cooperative. I've heard very few stories of where the banks aren't providing temporary or bridging finance for businesses to get through this period. So post this, I'd be keen to hear if anyone has had any issues with their bank. I could potentially guide you on how to get through those. But so far, what we're hearing is they've been very cooperative, and that's something that which is really good. And the rates have been pretty reasonable as well. On that topic, what isn't working so well within the banking sector is that new government guaranteed banking scheme. that has been treated by the banks currently as just a normal business loan of 500k or whatever number you're going for, and they're applying pretty prudent and cautious attitudes to lending those out. So that hasn't worked so far, but what has worked is banks providing temporary facilities to get people through this. But back to your cash flow forecast, what is really important is applying scenarios to that cash flow forecast, and what you really need to do is have 3 scenarios: a worst case, an expected case, and a best case. An expected case right now would look very much like a lockdown 4 for 4 weeks, which we've just had, how your revenues are impacted by lockdown 4, then 2 weeks of lockdown 3, and then potentially get into a lockdown 2. You could probably quite confidently say that's an expected case. A worst case is dipping back into lockdown 4. I know from my own business, my worst case scenario we put in to our bank was literally the next 6 months in lockdown 4 with no revenue. So that was a complete worst case, highly unlikely to happen, but we put that in place, gave that to our banker to get an indication of whether they would support us during that period. So I think that's something that allows you to sleep better at night if you understand what a worst case looks like and whether you have support to get through that. And obviously everything else that contributes to that cash flow forecast is negotiations with your landlord, which I think we'll probably cover off in more detail, but we've got at least 10 or 11 leases in our business, and what I can say is I've had 10 or 11 completely different answers when I've talked about negotiating with our landlords around rent abatements and reductions. So what I would say there is what has been interesting is they've really enjoyed the fact we've been transparent and honest and approached them. We haven't just turned the direct debits off without first discussing it. So I think it's really important that you are really transparent with staff, customers and suppliers around all your issues, and our experience to date has been they've been very forthcoming and very helpful, and we don't always get the answer we want, but we're certainly building up a relationship where we're in a position to further discuss and potentially get a good result for our business. So I think, look, putting all that into a melting pot, that should form a cash flow forecast, and that's something that is at least going to allow you to plan, engage with your banker appropriately, and at least allow you to understand where you are as of today for going forward. But I guess, look, what I would encourage people to do now, though, is certainly share any experiences they've had with their banks and potentially ask me any questions on the banking sector. I'm more than happy to ask and help guide people through that scenario.
So if anyone has any questions for either for Chris or Kayne, do you just want to raise your hand and I'll unmute you and you can... It's not like you to want to have something to say, John?
No, I've got a question. I found the contributions very useful, and just the last contribution around landlords being forthcoming. What does that mean? I mean, I'm a landlord and I know what forthcoming means to me. Certainly doesn't mean chopping back the monthly rental by 75% and not telling me. So we clearly understand that. But I heard your contribution last week, Shane, on this, and I've read some stuff that you've written for your own website, which is very useful around landlords being useful, because I don't know too many landlords that are that useful in the longer term. Although if you want to keep your client, you need to be, or your tenant, you need to be useful and supportive. But I think some people think that if they're paying now 25% arbitrarily, that is going to be the rent going forward for the next foreseeable future. And I've read your stuff, Shane, your legal stuff and interpretations, which I thought was good. And that is, we have to be very careful when we talk to people about, paying just 25%, unless you've got a Section 27 Auckland District Law Society rental agreement, tenancy agreement. So what do you say? I'm interested in what everyone else says about landlords being useful. They have to be useful, because I'm a landlord and I had to be useful when my tenant said to me, I'm only going to pay 25%. There's nothing much I can do at this stage. But I think tenants clearly need to understand that they have obligations under the lease, and going forward, they need to lock that down into their cash flows, certainly for medium-term cash flows, because you're not going to be able to run away from your tenancy agreements, are you?
John, I'm just going to get Michael. I know Michael Moughan. I know I was going to get you to speak about a slightly different topic, but Michael's written the best balanced, principled legal opinion about this whole position for the MBR last week. So he's been kind enough to come on here. So I might get you to, Michael, because obviously that will all be fresh in your head, just to canvass not just the positional stance of either a landlord or a tenant, but the whole kind of lay of the land in, say, 3 or 4 minutes. And that's probably the best person right now to speak to that whole issue.
Okay. Well, you're quite right, John.
You're a bit quiet, Michael.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Is that better? Great. I was going to say, you're quite right, John, that there is, there are kind of two things there. There's the legal position and what that is, and then there's also like the more practical position of what is going to be best for you to do for your own business, in the sense that, like, the legal position for most people will be the ADLS lease, and that determines that a certain amount of rent has to abate, a fair proportion, which is undefined and quite unclear, although there are good indications that in a situation like the present lockdown, where there's a total loss of revenue, the courts would likely see that to be half or something thereabouts. And so that's the legal position and the enforceable position. And obviously, if a tenant elects to pay less than that, you can pursue them under the lease. Of course, practically, there are two considerations there. One is that depending on the nature of the tenant and the quality of the security or guarantees that you have, you'll know that pursuing them might be a fruitless experience. I've certainly found that in the past. The other thing is that, of course, we can probably expect on the other side of this, as Kayne said, commercial property is going to be hit particularly hard, and it's very likely that there's going to be significant empty premises at the end of all this. And so the landlords that are going to do best will be the ones that are able to ensure that on the other side of this, they still have tenants and can start to receive rent again when those people begin to trade. Now, one thing that bears on that, which I think is particularly useful advice, is that there's a negotiation that can occur now with respect to what kind of abatement you're willing to provide a tenant. And one thing to definitely wrap into that is sort of tidying up your leases going forward. So, for example, it would be a bad idea if you have a tenant whose lease expires within 12 months to give them significant abatements on the principle that you'll get them through, because you may get them through, and in 12 months' time they may leave and seek a cheaper premises somewhere. Of course, the risk of that is very, very much related to whether they're the kind of business that has significant goodwill in the site. They're much less likely to do that. But if you're in office realty, for example, where people are using your premises as a back office and could very easily relocate, then that's clearly a concern. So yeah, it'd be prudent to wrap into any relief that you give a review of the ongoing legal arrangement.
Michael, could you also speak, just to give it some symmetry, could you also speak to tenants that are in a position where perhaps a landlord is being unreasonable or bullying in terms of a tenant protecting their position, acting reasonably, how they would best mitigate their position, taking into account cost, litigation risk of termination of lease, that whole narrative?
So the government has done a little, very little really, in that regards, but they have extended the period before a landlord can invoke the lease to kick you out for not paying rent. Probably the thing I'd advise tenants to do is to make use of the government loan scheme to the extent that that's available to them, and to initially to attempt to reach some sort of agreement with their landlord for an abated amount and then to pay that. But if the landlord is going to be stubborn about it and insist on enforcing the lease, if the lease has a clause that mandates an abatement, then the prudent position would probably be to pay if one could, but on account, with it being set out quite clearly to the landlord what you feel the legal position is, and what you intend to do about it on the other side of this, when you know, obviously a lot of litigation in this area will occur. I mean, in terms of litigation risk around all of that, the only significant risk there is acquiescence. You'd want to make it very clear that you don't agree with what your landlord is doing, and what you think would be reasonable. And of course, as I think you said last week, Shane, really with any kind of pre-litigation strategy, a big part of it is controlling the narrative and thinking when you do it. I mean, my business partner likes to say, dance like no one's watching, and email like you think it'll one day be read in a deposition. Like, you want everything to look eminently reasonable, very cooperative, very fair, and I mean, if you're going to be a bit sly with that, you know that the other side is you know, prone to getting hot under the collar and, you know, saying things off the cuff, you may want to consider appearing reasonable but saying things that are likely to provoke a bit of that reaction. The only other thing I'd mention there is that very few people know that in New Zealand it's legal to record phone calls if you're a party to that phone call, with the notable exception that you can't if you're a lawyer. So, you know, there could be, in any kind of dispute, there's often value in having a phone call where people are more candid and might say things that are going to be useful to you, and to record that. That's obviously broader than the present situation, but maybe worth mentioning.
Thanks, Michael. Brent Norling, you've been dealing with a lot of volumes. Brent's got a practice over the North Shore Norling Law, and is a young practitioner who's been very successful in litigation and dealing, very pragmatic lawyer in terms of dealing. And you've been dealing, I understand from talking to you, with a lot of inquiries and providing quite a lot of advice around this, Brent. So do you want to just quickly chime in as well? It'd be quite valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to. So I suppose the starting point for me is, hey, look, I'm not a property lawyer. I'm an insolvency restructuring lawyer fundamentally, and I stumbled into this area because a very good client of mine said, "Hey, Brent, I don't think I should pay my lease this month. Can you just look over this and tell me?" And then, you know, I found clause 27.5, and you know, we did a live video on it and ended up on breakfast TV. And because of that, my phone has just been ringing non-stop and dealing with this particular issue. And, you know, the kind of flavor that I have is tainted by the kind of calls that I'm having, which are fundamentally with tenants. And so I tend to have a very tenant-friendly view on this. And so, sorry, John. And it's because the stories that I'm hearing are absolutely brutal. I mean, we have small to medium business owners who are, a lot of them are just actually run their businesses month to month. Maybe they have a couple of months that they can weather the storm. But, you know, we're talking make or break for a lot of these people. And so I've definitely taken a more tenant-friendly approach, and I've managed to get a lot of landlords to do zero rent. So we've kind of taken the view that zero access means zero rent. And, you know, especially when we're talking about hospitality businesses who cannot work from home, you know, my business, I can continue to work from home. It's frustrating. I have screaming kids in the background up and down the hallway, but I can work, and these people can't. But I do echo what Michael has said, and one thing I've encouraged my tenants to do is to be open to washing up the terms of the lease. And there needs to be something in it for the landlord as well, and ultimately we want a long-term relationship. We're not trying to screw over landlords, we're just trying to get an arrangement in place where the tenants will survive and they'll come out of lockdown and they will have a business that can continue to operate. And so, we have been open to an extension of lease terms so that the landlord effectively will make the money back in the longer term. And that's generally the approach we've been taking. So whilst there have been some zero rents, there's also, again, the popular position for most has been, let's just meet in the middle. And there have been a lot of 50-50 arrangements. Very easy to negotiate for a tenant where they have the ADR lease with clause 27.5, but there are a lot of landlords out there with bespoke agreements, and they, from a legal perspective, is hard to negotiate because they are very much in the landlord's favour. But we kind of just park the legal issues to the side and let's deal with the practical issues here, which is you need a tenant, they want a business. So how are we going to make sure that both these things happen? Because I don't think anyone's going to be signing new leases in May. I mean, it's not very likely.
I'll just speak to that as well, just to sum all that up. So from what I've seen, landlords and tenants have both been guilty of being overly positional in terms of what they think their entitlement, with very little regard to the other party in each case. And some of the negotiations I've been dealing with, what I've seen is that the parties would actually been better off if they'd never called their lawyers in the first place, and if they managed to there's so many different factors from both sides, and I've read so much stuff that really does end up every which way at around 50%. And bearing in mind that this really should only go on this period of no access, whether it's under clause 27 or under the property law, common law, whatever, it's really only going to go on most likely for 1 to 3 months. Now, the longer term view is that, based on all the things we're seeing out of the Northern Hemisphere, is that rents may have a lot of pressure, and this whole argument may become almost redundant within 6 to 12 weeks, because then the discussion may be more around, can landlords sustain these rents? And that's another issue altogether. It's not a legal issue, it's a commercial issue. So at the moment, and I'm really talking to smaller volume or quantum leases, not a year leases here. The message really is to try and negotiate, because even to get something through arbitration, if that's not important, that's maybe 5-7 grand with a lawyer, 20 to get it into court, and all of a sudden that's probably in most cases more value that people are actually arguing over. So this whole thing, it really does come down to the conduct of the parties. And because New Zealand the government hasn't decided to legislate as Australia has done, the parties really do need to sort it out. Otherwise, the position's just going to be made, in my view, so much worse by getting it all hot and bothered about this. Next person, I just want to jump in quickly, if you would. Brad Jacobs from the Coffee Club and Bird on the Wire, the chairman of the Franchise Association. I know Brad's been obviously talked about too positional, but Brad obviously has a lot of skin in the game and has a lot of parties he's having to negotiate with and help, and has been reasonably vocal in the media about. Brad, would you like to speak to it?
Sure, yeah. So we hold about 72, 73 leases. I personally hold 70 of those. We hold all of our head leases for our franchisees apart from 2, which is just for 2 unusual historic reasons. So yes, it's been me that's been working on this non-stop for the last 4 weeks. I have had that full range of replies from landlords that you could expect, from extremely helpful on the first day, with very much the attitude of you're not earning revenue, so we don't expect you to pay rent, and that was a very small handful. The biggest majority have sort of been sitting somewhere in the middle, with the constant expectation that the government is going to release some kind of code of conduct. And that's pretty much where all of the big landlords, or any of the even sort of slightly professional small landlords, are kind of sitting still. And I think there is still that expectation that some kind of code is going to come. Clause 27.5 is certainly not the saviour. For me, it's only in 11 of our leases. It's a relatively new clause in the grand scheme of things, if you think it only came out after the Christchurch earthquakes. And of course, it's not in any of the big, sort of institutional kind of landlords' leases, because obviously they don't use the ADLS lease for starters. So it's certainly, it's been a little bit helpful. But those 11 that clause does sit in, I can probably say I've had 11 different responses on that as well. So, and the ADLS group were pretty quick to come out, obviously, and say that yes, we wrote it, but we're not going to be the ones to tell people how to interpret it. So, not sure that was super helpful either. We've got a small group of horrendous landlords. I am up to about 4 or 5 demand notices. I got my first legal threat on the 2nd of April. So we wrote to all of our landlords around the 29th, 30th of March. I got my first reply on the 2nd of April, my first threat on the 2nd of April from just a one-off landlord that owns a tenancy on a main road. And that simply said, we've made our position clear. Rent is due on the 1st of April. If it's not paid by this afternoon, we will take action to recover it from the guarantor, which is obviously me. And I've had, as I say, probably 4 or 5 along those lines now. So yeah, not any actual official default notices yet, but certainly those kind of threatening emails.
Brad, obviously you would have given this some thought, and I've seen some of the correspondence from you regarding what would you like to see done?
Sure. Look, I think, at the end of the day, landlords are not the enemy, and I totally get that. Both parties need to succeed. It's that simple. This, sort of constant kind of plea, or I don't know what word you want to use from the government, to people to be nice, to work together. Those landlords that were prepared to be nice people, to be good citizens, all those other nice terms that have been used, they did that. They did that within the first few days, and some of them are now coming back to us again already. In the last few days of this month, saying we know that you're not going to be back to normal next month, so let's open up a discussion about next month already. Those people are doing that, but the reality is, the biggest chunk are sitting somewhere in the middle between, we need someone to tell us what to do, and we don't care, pay your rent, full stop. And those landlords are not going to change. They're not going to become nice people or good citizens because someone keeps asking them to. The only way to get that group, and if you look at our number, it's not even 10%, but again, holding all the head leases and holding the personal guarantees, that could unravel my entire business. If we have 5, 6, 7 of those landlords that take that position, the franchisees fail, and all those responsibilities end up back on me. So, so to answer your question, I believe a code of conduct of some form, similar to what the Australian government has done, is essential.
Anyone else want to speak to that just before we move on? Because I don't want to get stuck on it forever. People obviously have things to do. Anyone else want to speak to the whole lease? Nick Turner, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll just second all of what Brad said, really. When you hold the personal leases like we do as well at sales, 36 or so. But yeah, I mean, and I think it's more the way the landlords communicated with us. But I guess one sort of question I had, and obviously neither Brad or I plan on being in court arguing with a landlord anytime soon, because again, I'm sure, like Brad, probably 80% of our relationships with the landlords are good, but for the 20%, maybe 90% are very good, but the 10% that are sending those threats, on day 2 and 3 and 4 and 10 of April, it is pretty hard to go back level-headed, especially when you just feel they are so out of touch with the tone of the nation, and literally the words of the Prime Minister and Grant Robertson, and even though I totally agree with Brad, they haven't done enough for this. But as far as it's sort of hard, and even for the agreements that don't have 27.5, I sort of feel that 27.5 was put in because of the earthquake, clearly a state of emergency, sort of mandated because that was the right thing to do. So I sort of, again, I'm just sort of rambling on that, but I still feel even with a lease that doesn't have 27.5, ethically it's the right thing to be able to have a civil conversation with a landlord at a time like this, where it's clearly in everybody's interest to have businesses still able to pay rent or survive first and foremost. And I think that's the thing too, probably what Brad is, business owners are hoping to survive first and foremost. And I guess when you're sort of getting legal threats, it is hard to sort of sometimes deal rationally with those. But so I guess I'm just sort of agreeing with what Brad said, and hopefully doesn't seem the government is going to come out with any further help or guidance. But on a mid to long term basis, you want to survive first and foremost. And so hopefully landlords understand that. John obviously said that he did, and I think probably most do, but the other 10%, I would think if you're taken to court over something like this right now, it's hard to see a judge sort of being too hard on you, but I could be wrong. Some of the lawyers here could.
You're right.
But yeah.
John Banks, you've been through a few economic cycles in your times. Do you want to just have a few quick words about that, and then we'll move on to the next?
Yeah, well, I mean, I sat in a cabinet where we bailed out the Bank of New Zealand in 1990, and it was interesting, exactly 100 years previously, a cabinet in 1890 bailed out the Bank of New Zealand, so these things are cyclical. And you can go 2007, 2012, 2016, you can look at the Spanish flu, you can look at SARS, you can look at all sorts of things. These things are cyclical, and, they come and go. They just reset ourselves, and no one really believes that this is the first pandemic that, that the young fellas in the team are going to be facing, because it could well come back. So, it's a time to sort of rethink about the way we do business and the way that business is done. It's going to be a very different place. 80% of businesses will survive and they'll get through, and they'll be stronger businesses. One of the problems we have with tenants and buildings that fundamentally going into COVID, they weren't structurally sound. And of course, COVID is enough to tip them over. And many of them haven't been tipped over, but they believe in their minds that they're going to be tipped over. It's a mindset thing for a lot of people, and they're very, very nervous. They wake up in the morning. I've got someone who is burning $85,000 every day of the week, 7 days a week before he gets out of bed. 85,000. So, he's feeling the edge. So I love the legal perspective that Michael talked about. It's going to be, negotiated between parties and not lawyers. And by the way, we're not going to see anyone in court in the next 6 weeks. If you know what the agendas are up at the High Court, we're not going to see anyone in court around these matters for 18 months, I wouldn't think, Michael. So it's a matter of dealing with the landlords. But one of the big hurdles that we're going to have right across the country with banks, lending institutions and landlords is this whole personal guarantee thing. I gave up signing personal guarantees when I was 50. I said, I'll never do it again. And it's a good idea and a good lesson to Nick and to Brad. Personal guarantees can come back and bite you savagely. So whatever personal guarantees you've done, you want to spend a bit of time thinking about your personal finances and barricading yourself at some level with some good legal advice. Barricade yourself, because they'll come down the track at you for sure with the 20% of the 100% that Nick talked about. So I think it's a matter of some common sense and common ground on all of this, but I know where the casualties are going to be. The casualties are going to be with landlords more than tenants. Landlords, because if my tenant said to me, listen, I've told you I'm going to pay you 20% and next month's going to be the same, and so is the following month. Now lease ends in December, as you know, and we're not going to pay any more than 20% through till December. What am I going to do about it? I mean, I can go and see my lawyer Shane, I could even go and see someone like Michael, but really there's not much I can do about it. So it's a you catch flies with honey, not with vinegar. So it's a matter of talking to people nicely and trying to negotiate a position before you reach for the phone for the lawyer, and certainly before you start proceedings in the High Court. That would be my view. But, there's a wonderful saying that I was taught as a young guy when I used to get myself into a lot of trouble in another life, and I want to share it with everyone. And it goes like this: 9 times out of 10, it doesn't happen. And when it does, it's only half as bad. So as I look out at the landscape from sitting high above the waterfront here on the viaduct on this beautiful day, I'm thinking to myself, we're going to come out of this a lot stronger than we think. So we have to get our minds into the right mind shape. We have to reset, recheck, reset, and re-gear ourselves. One of the contributions very early on, Shane, was the fabulous contribution about cash flow profiles. That was a really good contribution. And, they have to be quantified, and they have to be measurable, and they have to be sound, and they have to be sensible. And you must make yourself pedantically accountable to that cash flow profile that you're building for yourself if you want to get through. And that's a very significant point that was made today.
Thanks, John. Okay, so just a couple more things we're going to cover off. I was going to speak to something that is not on people's radar at the moment that may well be coming up, but I'm just going to do it in about 60 seconds rather than 5 minutes. So shareholder disputes, we're going to see people under a lot of pressure in the next 3 to 6 to 9 months, and who knows beyond that. So with shareholders having disputes, a lay person's way of explaining this is that the position under the Companies Act is that if a shareholder has acted, say you've been in business for 5, 10 or 15 years, a certain way, and if that shareholder, because they've got money problems at home, the husband or wife has lost their job, mortgage is too high, if they all of a sudden start acting in a way which the law looked at reasonably is a departure from the understanding that those shareholders had to hold that business together, the way that business was run, just taking money out when they previously didn't, or not agreeing on things, or taking out finance using the company's security when without agreement, where previously there was a board meeting about something like that, that may be grounds for what we call oppressive relief or oppressive shareholder claim in the High Court. Brent, I know Norling has done quite a few of these. I've done some of the pre-litigation on that. I'm sure Michael and Brett Gower and maybe James Donkin, who's on here as well, other lawyers have as well. So all I want to convey for now is, if you are having problems with a shareholder and they are acting in that way, it is worth talking to one of us about what could possibly be done in terms of pre-litigation strategy. And like Michael, who spoke so eloquently about the whole dancing, however you want by yourself, but really having those emails written as if they're going to be viewed by the court. you really need to engage the lawyer. A lot of people don't want to call us at the beginning because we're $500 an hour plus, but sometimes that's false economy, because getting your ducks lined up. I mean, I saw yesterday some emails from a landlord client where they really made things worse for themselves before talking to me. Obviously, probably in the interest of saving money, but to talk to us quickly, it can be a conversation. We can steer them in terms of how they should be dealing with this problem, because I can see things like that. I've already had one a couple of days ago, but I can see that becoming the next thing, where businesses are under pressure, they're fraught, and people are doing maybe silly things that they previously weren't doing. So there are ways to deal with that. It's not, you're not completely at the whim, even if you are in a small, closely held company and you think, oh, court is too expensive and it's something I don't want to get into. There are ways to use the threat or the possibility of that, knowing that there could be sanction for someone acting in that way. So yeah, you speak to one of us if you have that sort of problem. The last person I'm going to get to speak is actually, I think he's still here. Can I see him? Jordan, are you still here, or did you skedaddle?
Yeah, still here, Shane.
I can't see you. Where are you, mate?
You can click on the right.
Oh, there we go. So Jordan is from RealYou, and RealYou is a AML compliance software company, and he's just going to speak very quickly now, because we want to wrap this up pretty shortly. But he's just going to speak about some data that he's got in terms of clients, obviously without naming any names, around the country in terms of who's doing what in terms of ID checks and how active or not active people are, because there's a lot of hoopla, and I saw he sent me yesterday some information Equifax also released about their activity, because there's a lot of hoopla about what people are doing and not doing, and we get the unemployment rate quoted all the time, and we get this and that. But this has been for me, with my association with Jordan, a very good way of seeing some actual live indications about what's going on. So Jordan, I'm just going to unmute you. Sorry, I'm not very technically capable.
Can everyone hear me?
Oh, here we go. Yep.
Yeah, great. So firstly, yeah, I definitely share John's optimism that things will get better, and our data is certainly showing that. Shane, you touched on an Equifax report that was released, and I guess their sentiment, I think, was a little bit more negative than mine. They were talking about things being worse than the GFC. We're not seeing that. So the data that I've collected, I look at it as a very early economic indicator. So for those of you who are unaware, AML checks are required before you can do business by lawyers, accountants, residential, commercial, real estate agents, business brokerage firms, and financial institutions. So the data that we've seen is that the worst looks like it's over. We looked at, I guess, the AML checks done on a weekly basis, and the weekly change during this COVID-19 period. We saw that the last week in March was fairly devastating, and we saw that checks across the board were down, over 65%. The good news is that since then, so during the month of April, we've seen that the volume of AML checks has actually been quite stable. This week in particular has rebounded quite swiftly. So we're looking to see this week, at least a 30% bounce or rebound over the past couple of weeks. Obviously, April overall, and this is, I guess, mirrored by Equifax's data, April overall is forecast to be down about sort of 50%. But we do think that will be the worst of it. In regards to sectors, we deal with a very broad range of phase 2 entities and also phase 1. So that includes predominantly property, business sales, commercial leasing, legal, accounting, and bookkeeping. So our forecasts for April, and I'm sure most of you could agree with this, are that we're going to see, we're forecasting for probably a 75% decrease in AML check volume, specifically in sort of property, business sales, and commercial leasing. We're finding sectors that are less affected, certainly legal, accounting and bookkeeping. The reason, obviously, because as a lot of you have touched on, is those that can provide their services online are obviously sitting in a better position than those who traditionally have had to sort of meet people face to face to actually perform business. But in summary, the reality of it is that we believe the worst is actually over. And I know people talk about a V-shaped recovery, but our data certainly suggests that. And Shane, I put together the data that we're seeing, which I'm happy to share with you and you can provide to everyone. But we certainly think the worst is over, and we are seeing early signs of an actual rebound. If you can provide your services online, do it. Those who are fortunate enough to be able to are definitely seeing a lot better, and we're seeing that in our data. Another point that we're seeing is there has obviously been a lot of cuts to discretionary spending. So in our business, I guess we look at that as we offer two services. One is an outsourced function for AML or identity checks, and another is an online DIY service. Obviously, the latter is a cheaper variation of it. So we're seeing, I guess, more people having time on their hands, so they're doing the checks themselves. And we're seeing the outsourced function is taking a larger hit because we're looking at that as more of a discretionary spend. In regards to sort of bright spots, we're seeing household brands and also, I guess, firms that are geographically diversified are doing a bit better than ones that are smaller, that are just operating in I guess, a single location. A piece of advice from our business is that and I guess this can be applied to landlords as well, is be proactive. So we are all in this together. Everyone's taking a hit financially. So we've taken a really proactive stance in being supportive to our customers. So, we expect for the first time that we may not see invoices paid. So we're offering incentives for people, if they can, to pay their invoice on time. We're giving them credits to use the next month. We're also extending payment terms for those who can't. So I think, and I have heard, a lot of you say, the 20% of those horror stories in regards to landlords. I think how brands deal with this situation will become their brand. So the more supportive you can be, sure, it might hurt financially in the short term, but in the long term, I think it's going to be very beneficial for your brand. So yeah, that's all I've got to say, but more than happy to share all my data with everyone here today.
Thanks heaps, Jordan. Hey, Chris Small, we're just going to unmute you. We're going to wrap everything up now. If anyone has any more questions, you can just email. I'll provide afterwards a list of all the people that on his emails. I'm sure no one will have an issue with that, and anyone can just ask us that stuff. But Chris, do you just want to, I think you're the best person to just quickly sum everything up and say a few words, and then we'll get out of here.
Thanks, Shane. Yeah, no, I think firstly, thanks for everyone contributing today. I think we've held a number of these forums, myself and Shane, and the best bits from all of these things is learning off each other. I especially enjoyed John Banks. Thanks for your contribution, John. It was fantastic. And an old dog who's been in these situations before, there's sort of nothing better than learning from someone who's actually experienced themselves, because you look around here, there's a few of us who perhaps went round in the Great Depression. So look, I think that's the first key thing, is that we're all learning off each other, and that's great. Especially back to Jordan's comments, everything we're saying to our clients is be pragmatic, act with integrity, and act with honesty and transparency, because you're exactly right. People will always remember what you were like during the tough times. Everyone can be a good guy and a good person when things are going well and you're making lots of money. So this really will define lots of companies during this period. I mean, one antidote I've heard, and I hope there's no one from Westfield here, but Westfield is not giving anyone any relief. And straight away, I'm going to ban my wife from going to Westfield. I mean, I'm going to do that anyway, because it's going to help my personal balance sheet. But just little things like that, and seriously, people will remember it. So I think Jordan's comments are really relevant about, this does define your brand, and it's also how you behave with your staff. It's how you treat the subsidy. Keep your staff if you can, because this is back to Jordan's data, this is going to be shorter term than we think. I mean, for goodness sake, we only had 5 new cases yesterday. If that was in America, Donald Trump would say they've completely eliminated COVID-19. So we are in a great position. So I think let's all be sensible, be smart, and be, I think most importantly, pragmatic and act with integrity, and we'll all come through this, because New Zealanders generally have a good heart and they'll look after people who behave in good fashion. And again, agreeing with Jordan, I had my national team meeting with all my guys across New Zealand today, and they all said that inquiry levels on new businesses, people wanting to sell their businesses, people wanting to buy a business, was back to sort of, we dropped off basically to almost zero in the first couple of weeks, and we're slowly building up, and this has been our busiest week yet. Not to say we're back to pre-COVID levels at all, but we're getting back there slowly but surely. And I think under lockdown level 2, which is not too far away, hopefully I think that's when we'll really start feeling as though we're getting back to normality, with cafes open, gyms opening. John will be able to go on his fancy boat in the harbour, so things will start getting back to normal. So that's probably all from me. But as I say, if you've got any questions around cash flow, banking, and you've got some of the best lawyers in town here, please feel free to contact any of us. All our services are free of charge. We just want to help people during this time and get through it, so we can all sort of live to fight another day in a couple of months. So yeah, thanks Shane for organising. Great session.
Awesome. Thanks guys. Thank you.
Thanks everybody. That was great. Cheers. Thanks for coming.
Thank you guys. Thank you.